Coral reefs are the vibrant, beautiful, wonderful cornerstones of the ocean's ecosystem. But what if they could be something even more? What if humans could use coral reefs as a form of protection from wave damage?
What we are doing through this project is combining our green approach, focused on growing and planting corals, with a gray approach, which uses cement to build platforms that can house these corals. So by combining green and gray infrastructure, we're hoping to develop a very efficient artificial reef that maximizes the benefit for both ecological services as well as coastal resilience. We're trying to build a better reef to protect our shorelines.
During Andrew, I was living in South Dade, and that area was not immediately on the coast, but still saw significant damages from the storm surge. Luckily, in the southern portion of the county, we had the protection of a good amount of mangrove forest that minimized that storm surge. The same is not true for Miami Beach, and we've been lucky for the last actually several years, and if we get a direct impact, it will be catastrophic. During these last few storms, we see the coasts becoming smaller and smaller, which requires them to be, nourished again, to allow for people to enjoy the beaches. I mean, Florida, Miami is a huge touristic destination, and people come here to enjoy the beaches. If there's no beach to enjoy, that directly impacts the economy.
Miami is actually the #1 city in the world exposed to coastal flooding in terms of assets exposed. So what that means for us, for those of us who live and work in the area, is that our livelihoods are at stake. The problem of coastal flooding from waves is one that has historically been an issue. This is a really complex problem, and it's going to require a really complex solution. We've been able to design all these different types of engineered structures that we can basically armor our coastlines with. Things like seawalls, things like riprap or jetties, all these things that humans are putting into their coastlines in order to protect themselves. But this problem is not going away, and even with these armored coastlines, we still need a better solution.
It's very common these days to deploy cement-based solutions to coastal erosion or flooding. The problem with those structures is that, first of all, they're very costly, and once deployed, they stay where they are. If sea level rises, they stay where they are, so they become flooded, they get deeper, and their mitigation capabilities is reduced.
We can't use solutions that have just worked in the past, because the threats that we're facing are not going to be the same threats that we faced in the past. We need to scale up, and we need to figure out different adaptive strategies that we might have to change along the way in order to protect ourselves and to protect our livelihoods.
At the University of Miami, researchers are doing exactly that. In their search for innovative solutions, UM's reef restoration researchers are turning to coral reefs for coastal protection.
People might think that it's easy to put a breakwater, submerged concrete breakwater along, say, the coastline of Miami Beach, but as we all know, the coastline of Miami Beach is very long, and such a structure is going to be very expensive. If you can get corals to grow in these areas naturally, corals are actually self-growing, self-repairing, self-building. So if we can create an environment where corals are able to grow and flourish, and actually corals will do the process of building this structure sort of at no cost to us once we get them going. And that comes with it a whole bunch of attendant benefits. We have fisheries protection, we have potential tourist revenue, and I think it's something that can also help kind of capture people's imagination that the very organisms that are threatened by climate change might be the organisms that actually help us confront that challenge.
So these ecosystems, when healthy, again, coral reefs, seagrasses, and mangroves, provide the first line of defense against the impacts of waves and storms. When you lose corals on a reef, you not only lose the living component of these coral reefs, but you also lose structure. So when you lose the structure, then the waves are able to just go over these reefs without losing any energy, and they impact the shorelines at full strength.
People are realizing that the existential threat to reefs is actually climate change, and that as the Earth continues to warm, coral reefs may in fact be the first ecosystem that we lose as a result of climate change. So there's been a huge effort to try to develop and test interventions, ways in which science can be applied to reef restoration to try and increase the thermal tolerance of these reefs and give them a fighting chance of surviving climate change.
For the past 10 years, we've been growing corals within in-water nurseries and then planting them out on local reefs to enhance population abundance and also enhance the resilience value of these coral reefs.
We grow these corals from small fragments and watch them grow over time. Once they're big enough, we actually fragment them and we take one piece and put it back out either onto the reef or to our substructure. And it doesn't even end there. We end up monitoring that for 1 month to 2 months to sometimes 6 months to a year, and really seeing that growth and that life come back to the reef. It's been really rewarding to watch these fragments that we plant out onto the reef grow into these nice, beautiful, healthy thickets that are attracting fish, and they're attracting life, and they're seeding the reef with new strains of coral.
Coral reefs are sometimes called the rainforests of the sea because coral reefs are recognized as being the most biodiverse ecosystem on the planet in the marine realm. And in terms of the species diversity on coral reefs, it's kind of comparable to the species diversity that people see in rainforests, and everybody knows how biodiverse rainforests are. How do we leverage those benefits of coral reefs to our own advantage, not just to increase biodiversity benefits, but specifically to help us protect coastlines from the damaging effects of storm surge?
We can measure regaining fish habitat, we can measure how healthy the reef is when we restore a reef, but we can't really measure coastal protection benefits that come from restoration, or at least we haven't yet. So we were trying to devise a way to study how restoration alone can protect the shoreline. We wanted to explore in a controlled setting, how can we measure the reduction of waves from a coral reef. So we ended up building these coral structures made of real coral skeletons and testing them in our giant wave tank.
So the sustain tank is a wind wave tank, so we can generate our own waves combined with wind, and we can have the actual conditions of a storm.
My main contribution to the project is using the Sustained Wind Wave Laboratory to test different reef configurations and coral configurations to help us to better understand where the corals need to be planted, how thick they need to be planted, and what kind of protective benefits can we expect in different wave conditions.
While we did realize that there was some amount of protection that a restored reef could contribute, it wasn't nearly on the scale of what we needed for coastal protection in a place like Miami Beach, which is very vulnerable to coastal threats.
So, in search of a solution that could have a greater impact, these researchers turned to UM's College of Engineering to create a structure that could house the coral clusters above it.
When we're designing buildings for humans, we have guidelines and we have design criteria that have been documented. But when you design for a living organism that is actually out there, that cannot express its feeling, at the point where we have to do experimental tests with the actual organism on the actual site, with the actual structure, then this is new and challenging for me, but I learned to appreciate the complexity of the living organism. So the idea here is that we have a trapezoidal structure. We started with this design because it's a common design for coastal engineering applications when it comes to wave energy dissipation. So we're trying to see what are the characteristics of that structure that will allow it to dissipate more energy. So to design our artificial coral reef, so a structure that will dissipate the energy of the waves as well as be hospitable to corals, we are working in the sustain tank. In our experiment, we're putting a scaled model of the structure that we're interested in. This is a structure, a physical model of the structure made out of wood, because we focus mainly on the geometry. And what we're doing measurements all around the tank, mainly before and after that structure, sometimes actually on the structure itself, so we can evaluate its impact. What we did there is we combined basically tests with a reef, a bare reef, which is what you see there, and the reef with coral skeletons on it. So there we can evaluate, given the same conditions, the effect that comes out from the corals being on top of it.
When you have a very complex 3D structure that's created by living corals, then the energy of the waves gets mitigated. So we're able to model at meaningful scales the benefits of both submerged structures as well as structures with corals on top of them. What we found is that, yes, every time you deploy a submerged structure, obviously because of its complexity, it will mitigate the impacts of wave energy. But when you add corals on top of that, because of the friction that corals add, living corals add to these submerged breakwaters, you're getting an extra 10 to 15% reduction in wave height and wave energy.
Aside from understanding how the enhanced reefs can better protect us, we also wanted to understand what exactly is happening on the land side. We did a transect across our urban areas in what is known as the Flamingo Park and Ocean Drive historic districts. We wanted to look at what these historic buildings had as attributes and how they would perform in the face of these climate challenges. And then we also looked at North Beach, a part of the neighborhood where we could understand how these larger buildings and multifamily buildings could perform as well. We tried to do that by looking very specifically at the building attributes, one parcel after another. Once we had a full set of parameters that we knew were very unique to coastal communities, in particular ours here in South Florida, we then developed a model, and we weighed that model in such a way to understand, better understand exactly how those buildings and their structures could deal with the force of the waves in different scenarios. So if we couple that type of information with what was happening offshore with the enhanced coral reef, we could see that the presence of the enhanced reef does in fact play a central role in mitigating the wave action in these buildings overall. We should see it as a marriage between our natural defense systems and our man-made defense systems. By doing both of these things and doing them in a timely manner, we can make a difference. We can create a South Florida that can be here longer for generations to come.
The next step of our experiment is actually do a field experiment. So we're going to create and construct a structure that we're going to put out there in Miami Beach and make actual measurements on site. This structure is going to be out of concrete, actually a concrete recipe that is going to be more biophilic to the coral.
We're going to put a mixture of coral species onto these cement-based substructures, and they're going to be, in general, similar species to the species that are found off of Miami Beach naturally. And also, as part of the same program, we're trying to figure out which parts of the coastline of Miami Beach are best suited for this. Which area would you get the most, let's say, bang for your buck?
Once the structure is placed in the sea, after a while, there's going to be the entire restoration activities, and then we start a long process of monitoring. So we want to see how they actually grow and making measurements of wave energy dissipation. Before and after that structure, so that we can link back to our science and our findings from the laboratory testing in sustain, so then we can actually validate with what we see in the lab and the actual study from the site. Right now we're at the exciting state where we're waiting for the green light, but we're ready to go.